China's Navy won't even come close to matching the US Navy until at least 2049. That's not an insult from the US Navy commander. It's actually a relatively polite assessment from a Russian military expert. But the real issue is, given the way the Chinese Communist Party builds ships while constantly making adjustments and patching things up as they go, it's not even certain if they'll last until 2049, let alone catch up to the US Navy. On January 22nd, China's Navy made a big announcement about the commissioning of a 5,000-ton Type 054B frigate. State media insisted that it was a key piece of equipment for the Navy's transformation, but many people were left wondering, what does the 054B have to do with the military's transformation? The reality is, the 054B only exists because the older 054A had so many design flaws. It didn't even have enough space for essential supplies, and 8 crew members had to squeeze into a single cabin, leading to terrible living conditions that affected combat readiness. The frustration within the Navy was widespread, and even military enthusiasts knew that the 054A was basically a youth hostel at sea. So now, with the 054B, they've added 1,000 more tons of displacement, which means there's finally a bit more room, enough to store a few extra boxes of instant noodles and add some more bunks, and yet this minor upgrade is being hyped as a major transformation in naval strategy. The root of the problem goes back to the CCP's tendency to copy designs without fully understanding them. The 054 series was originally modeled after France's Lafayette-class frigates. However, those French ships are likely automated and require only 140 crew members to operate efficiently. But China didn't copy that part, so the 054A ended up needing 190 crew members but only had 140 beds. Of course, that led to overcrowding. Sailors stationed on the 054As during escort missions in the Gulf of Aden had to endure 6 months in those conditions. The 052D destroyer isn't much better, with reports of 16 sailors crammed into a single cabin. The real embarrassment is that aside from the added space for crew and supplies, the 054B has barely improved in terms of combat performance. Take the main gun, for example. The 054A was equipped with a 76mm cannon, a modified version of Russia's AK-176. It's capable of firing 20 rounds per minute, good for close-range air defense and naval combat. But for the 054B, they switched to a 100mm gun to increase single-shot power, yet its rate of fire dropped significantly. This drastically reduced its overall firepower and suppression capability. The 100mm gun itself is based on 1990s French technology, which is already outdated. And when China tried to replicate the system for the 054A, they ran into numerous technical issues. One ship, the Ma'anshan, failed 5 rounds of sea trials before barely passing. It was never particularly reliable. Compared to the new generation of frigates from other countries, which are equipped with 127mm naval guns, the 054B's firepower is unimpressive. China does have a 135mm naval gun, but it's too heavy and only suitable for destroyers over 7,000 tons. The 054B simply can't handle it, so in the end they had to settle for an outdated gun, wrapping it in a new stealthy-looking casing. This highlights a persistent problem in China's military-industrial system. Cost control and self-sufficiency are prioritized over actual performance improvements. The lack of real combat upgrades in the 054B is a direct result of this mindset. Now let's talk about propulsion. Chinese media boasts that the 054B uses a CODAD, combined diesel and diesel system, likely featuring 4 domestically produced 16 PC2 6-speed diesel engines generating 36,000 horsepower, an improvement over the previous 28,000 horsepower. However, since the ship's displacement has also increased, its top speed is still stuck at 27 knots. Meanwhile, modern Western frigates easily reach speeds above 30 knots. A slow speed is a serious weakness for anti-submarine operations, because U.S. nuclear submarines can cruise at over 33 knots. The 054B at just 27 knots won't be able to keep up with carrier strike groups, let alone chase submarines. A faster submarine could effortlessly maneuver behind it and launch a devastating attack. Some might ask, why not use a more powerful gas turbine engine? The answer is simple. China can't buy them and can't build them. The type of 50,000 to 60,000 horsepower power gas turbines China needs require advanced technologies like high-temperature alloys and turbine cooling. In the past, they might have been able to source parts from Ukraine, France, or the US, but today those supply chains are cut off. And with the economy struggling, there's only so much of the budget that can be allocated to military spending. The Navy isn't the only branch that needs funding. The Army and Air Force are also competing for resources. There's no room for massive R&D spending. In the end, all they could come up with was the 054B, something that looks new but is actually outdated. A decade from now, it might be seen as another half-finished project. Now look at the frigates operated by the US and its allies. The US Navy's Constellation-class frigates use advanced phased-array radars, gas turbines, and electric propulsion, putting them far ahead in overall capabilities. Japan's newly commissioned Mogami-class frigates have a full load displacement of 5,500 tons, a 70,000 horsepower propulsion system, high speed, stealth, and superior anti-submarine capabilities, all at a lower cost than the 054B. Meanwhile, France, Italy, and the UK have already moved into the era of fully electric-powered frigates, which are quieter and offer superior combat effectiveness. Meanwhile, the 054B has to worry about overloading its power supply every time it turns on its radar. Now let's talk about the 054B's anti-submarine capabilities. There's a widely circulated rumor among military enthusiasts, one that Chinese officials have never directly addressed. Allegedly, a U.S. Virginia-class nuclear submarine once locked onto China's Liaoning aircraft carrier group from as far as 92 nautical miles away in the Western Pacific. That kind of detection range is almost unheard of in underwater reconnaissance. What's even more shocking is that the U.S. submarine was able to silently close the distance to just 6 nautical miles from the Liaoning without being detected. The entire carrier group, including the 054A frigates, had no idea it was there. This story has gained traction because it exposes a major flaw in China's Navy. It simply does not have the sonar systems or tactical capabilities needed to detect and drive away U.S. submarines. The Virginia-class submarines are among the best in the world when it comes to stealth, detection, and maneuverability. They can pick up noise signals from an aircraft carrier group at long range using advanced sonar, and then use their sophisticated digital combat systems to track their target effortlessly. If this had been a real military confrontation, there's little doubt that the Liaoning and its escorts wouldn't have survived the first wave of underwater attacks. Some insider reports that the U.S. military is fully aware of just how ineffective China's anti-submarine defenses are. There was an incident where a U.S. Seawolf-class submarine was carrying out a special operation in the South China Sea. It was making a lot of noise, almost as if taunting the Chinese Navy. After much effort, China's forces managed to pick up a faint trace of it and sent 2 Type 093 nuclear submarines to intercept, but the Seawolf simply dove deeper and slipped away with ease. Worse yet, both Chinese submarines reportedly suffered structural failures due to water pressure and were lost. This incident highlights the massive technological and operational gap between the two sides, something that cannot be closed overnight. If China's Navy can't even keep up in submarine warfare, how can a frigate like the 054B possibly succeed in anti-submarine operations? Yet despite these challenges, China has positioned the 054B as an anti-submarine frigate, boasting that it's equipped with the HSAG-311 towed array sonar. But what are its actual capabilities? That's anyone's guess. The reliability of China's military industry data has always been questionable. To understand why, just look at their past claims. In the early 2000s, China's Type 054A frigate was equipped with just 206 passive towed array sonar. The Chinese government claimed that it had a cable length of 300 meters and could detect submarines 80 kilometers away. But here's the problem. The French DSBV 62C sonar, developed in the 1990s, had a 700-meter cable but only a 64-kilometer detection range. So how exactly did China's engineers manage to achieve world-leading anti-submarine capabilities with a shorter cable and a noisier ship? Now they claim that the 054B's HSJG-311 sonar has a detection range of over 100 kilometers. But that's likely based on ideal conditions. If we're playing the ideal conditions game, then theoretically, the UK's Type 26 frigate could detect targets 500 kilometers away. That's why these official claims should be taken with a grain of salt. When it comes to actual combat performance, nobody really knows how well the system will hold up. Given all these issues, it's no surprise that some people are comparing the 054B to Huawei's Mate 60 smartphone. Both were developed under international sanctions, both suffer from critical technological bottlenecks, and both are essentially stopgap solutions, functional but far behind true global standards. Take the Mate 60's chip, for example. It's supposedly based on a 7-nanometer process, but the quality of the manufacturing process and mass production yields remain unclear. It's mostly just hype from Chinese media. The same goes for the 054B. They increased the displacement and swapped out some equipment, but as for whether it can actually go head-to-head with the US Navy's next-generation frigates is in question. That's not to say that these developments are completely useless. But they do reveal that China is doing the bare minimum to maintain appearances and keep things running. Looking back at the development of China's small-tonnage naval vessels, the Chinese Navy has been stuck in a cycle of failure. Take the Type 056A light frigate, for example. It entered service in large numbers starting in 2013, with dozens of ships launched within just a few years. But less than a decade later, nearly all of them were either retired or repurposed as Coast Guard vessels. This means around $3 billion in military spending essentially went down the drain. The core issue? The strategy was to quickly build a massive fleet of cheap ships to make the Navy look powerful on paper. But because the technology behind them was inadequate and the designs lacked systematic planning, once it became clear they had little combat effectiveness, they were either handed over to the Coast Guard or left to rust in port. The 056 series failed this way, and the 054A series hasn't fared much better. Out of the 40 Type 054A frigates currently in service, internal sources suggest that nearly half spend most of their time sitting idle in port. The reasons? Poor living conditions and a lack of storage for essential supplies. Long-term deployments are unbearable for the crew, leaving them with little motivation to fight. On the surface, China's state-run military media brags that the 054A fleet is the second largest in the world among destroyer escort vessels. But when it comes to real operational readiness, it all depends on whether the sailors are willing to endure miserable conditions. The 054B is essentially a low-budget frigate that arrived 10 years late. It's still stuck at the most basic level, just trying to provide decent living conditions for the crew. But even with all these flaws, China has to build the 054B. Why? Because it allows the Chinese government to keep selling the illusion of progress to both domestic audiences and potential third-world allies. Meanwhile, the project also serves to enrich certain vested interests. As for whether the 054B is actually combat-ready, is almost irrelevant. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, the US and its allies are already moving forward with a new generation of naval warfare, unmanned vessels, AI-controlled operations, and fully electric propulsion. The focus is on stealth, low noise, high mobility, and digital command systems. The US Navy is rolling out unmanned warships like the Overlord and Sea Hunter programs, using AI for patrols, reconnaissance, and even combat missions. In the future, entire battle groups could consist of swarms of unmanned vessels led by just a few crewed flagships. Japan's Mogami-class frigates already use full electric propulsion and AI-assisted combat systems, making them the most advanced in Asia in anti-submarine warfare, missile defense, and electronic warfare. The latest frigates from the UK, France, and Italy have entered the ultra-quiet, all-electric smart control era. Their noise levels are so low that submarines can barely detect them, making them nearly invincible in anti-submarine warfare. Australia is directly integrating US AI-driven autonomous combat systems. Future destroyers and frigates may not even require a full crew, relying instead on automation, remote control, and AI-assisted decision-making. By 2023, these technologies will reach maturity, leading to the widespread deployment of unmanned fleets and beyond visual range joint combat scenarios. And what will China's 054B be doing? Still trying to figure out how to squeeze in a few more beds and stock up on instant noodles. If China wants to compete with the US and Western navies, it needs major breakthroughs in propulsion systems, automation, electronics, and onboard weapons. But with its access to Western technology now completely blocked, the path of copying foreign designs is no longer an option. As early as 2018, the US began restricting the export of sensitive technologies. By 2020, 7 companies and institutions like Huawei, SMIC, Harbin Institute of Technology, and the 7 Sons of National Defense were all placed on the US Entity List. Chinese PhD students studying in the US were increasingly advised to leave or were outright banned from entering certain laboratories. Restrictions were imposed on aerospace, semiconductors, AI, quantum computing, lithography machines, and advanced materials. By 2023, the US, Japan, and the Netherlands further escalated sanctions, making it even harder for China to advance in key technologies. Even SMIC's 7-nanometer chip production had to be done in secret, with poor yields that couldn't meet the demands of high-end military applications. In the past, Chinese STEM students could still apply to Western research institutes individually, enter laboratories, and secretly transfer technology back home. But now, Chinese nationals can forget about gaining access to labs specializing in aerospace, microelectronics, quantum computing, biotechnology, or chip manufacturing. What about independent development? The real bottlenecks in advanced military technology, such as single-crystal turbine blades for jet engines, ultra-high-temperature alloys, naval phased array radars, digital combat management systems, hypersonic weapon guidance, and precision missile propulsion, aren't things that can be solved just by throwing more people at the problem. These require decades of fundamental research. Without steady input from Western technology, Chinese military researchers are lost at sea. As a result, China's military-industrial complex is now at a standstill, or even regressing. The 054B frigate is a perfect example. It's not moving forward in weapon systems, but actually backtracking, which signals deeper problems within the R&D system. This leaves China with no choice but to keep producing warships that are technologically behind the West, using a build, modify, repair cycle, until they become obsolete and are retired. The Chinese military knows this wastes defense spending and fails to create a truly capable fighting force, but there's no alternative. Experts predict that in just a few years, China will roll out the 054C and 054D, modifying the design every 3 years and replacing it every 5, dumping more and more money into an endless cycle. As one Russian expert put it, by 2049, China might have a massive fleet, but the technological gap with the US Navy will be even wider than it is today. It becomes clear that the Chinese Navy lacks a stable, long-term roadmap for the next few decades. For the leadership, the priority is seeking record-breaking ship production numbers, not investing decades into breaking through technological barriers and perfecting key military systems. This short-term mindset was evident in the rushed production of the 056A, 054A, and 052D. The focus is on getting ships into the water and making headlines. Whether they'll need repairs in a few years or whether they can hold up against next-generation threats is an afterthought. For military officers who genuinely want to improve China's naval capacities, this is frustrating. But for those profiting from defense contracts and the constant cycle of production, it's the perfect system. This isn't about criticizing the 054B itself, it's about condemning the CCP's self-deceptive policies and short-sighted strategy. Simply put, the 054B is just a low-budget stopgap warship rolled out under technological blockades and economic pressures to keep up appearances.